The air over London in the spring of 1413 hung thick with mist, as if the very heavens had paused to watch a kingdom trying to remember what peace felt like. The Thames drifted slowly under the gray morning light, its surface dull and silent, carrying the weight of years of unrest. Inside Westminster, the torches along the walls flickered and whispered against the damp stones. The echo of prayers mingled with the shuffling of courtiers' boots. It was a coronation day, yet the mood was neither triumphant nor festive. It was the stillness that comes after a storm, when the sky has not yet decided whether to clear or to break again. Henry, the young heir of the House of Lancaster, stood at the threshold of the Abbey, his face calm, his eyes fixed ahead. He was 26, yet the lines around his eyes spoke of a life that had already known burden and judgment. The death of his father, Henry IV, only weeks before, had left him not only a crown, but a debt, one owed not in coin, but in faith, for England was not at ease with itself. The crown his father had worn was still seen by many as stolen. The bloodless rebellion that had brought the Lancastrians to power had left a scar in the mind of the nation. To rule England was one thing, to justify the right to rule it was another. The people had long memories. They remembered Richard II, the deposed king who had died in captivity, his death surrounded by mystery and silence. They whispered his name, as if it might still rise to accuse the living. The act of dethroning an anointed king had torn through the sacred fabric of monarchy. Every sermon since had wrestled with the same unspoken question. If kings could fall by men's hands, where did divine order end and ambition begin? That shadow lingered over everything Henry inherited. Under his father, the kingdom had survived but never healed. Henry IV's reign was marked by illness, rebellion, and fear. The Welsh had risen under Owain Glyndwr, the Percys had turned their swords against the crown, and Parliament had grown bold in its demands. England's fields were poor, its nobles restless, its treasury strained, and while the crown remained upon the king's head, the people saw in him not strength, but struggle. He ruled like a man besieged, his authority constantly tested, his legitimacy never fully secure. The young Henry had lived all of it, had fought beside his father, had bled for the throne, had felt the eyes of doubt upon him since boyhood. Yet his own youth had not always reflected discipline. Before the war, before the crown, there had been the prince called Hal, the restless, laughing heir who slipped through taverns in Eastcheap, drinking with commoners, mocking courtiers, pretending for a while that he was no prince at all. The stories of his wildness spread through London, told with a mix of amusement and reproach. But in those years of disguise lay something deeper than indulgence. Hal learned to know the hearts of men who would one day fight for him, the soldiers, the laborers, the ones who carried England on their backs. Then came the rebellion of 1403, the Battle of Shrewsbury, and the boy's life changed forever. It was his first true taste of war. Amid the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves, the young prince fought at the front lines, where an arrow struck his face and nearly ended his life. He fought on, refusing to leave the field. When victory came, it came at a price. The wound never fully left him. It marked him as one who had looked into the mirror of death and returned changed. Those who saw him afterward spoke of a new gravity in his manner, a silence that had replaced his old laughter. The reckless prince began to fade, and in his place a man of purpose began to take form. His father's final years deepened that transformation. Henry IV was consumed by sickness and guilt. The prophecy that he would die in Jerusalem haunted him, and when his body failed in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster, he took it as divine irony. Prince Henry knelt beside his bed, hearing the frail voice of a man who had fought too long to keep his crown. "You must heal the land," the dying king whispered, "not with steel, but with honor." The words fell like an inheritance heavier than gold. When the old king breathed his last, the chamber fell silent, except for the sound of rain on the leaded glass. The day of the coronation came soon after. The abbey was filled with the scent of wax and incense. Nobles in scarlet cloaks stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants and monks. The Latin chants rose to the vaulted ceiling as the young king approached the altar. Outside, the rain eased, and a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, striking the crown as it was placed upon his head. The witnesses would speak of it for years. A sign, they said, that heaven had blessed this reign. Henry's expression, however, was not one of triumph. He stood still, solemn, as if aware that the light had found him not as a gift, but as a command. In that moment, the ghosts of his past seemed to gather around him. Richard II, whose fall had cursed his house, his father, whose doubts had chained his spirit, the nameless dead who had fallen at Shrewsbury and Wales. Henry carried them all into his kingship. He did not swear vengeance or glory, but something quieter, the vow that his reign would bring redemption to the name of Lancaster, and through it, to England itself. The months that followed his coronation began to reveal the nature of the new king. Gone was the reckless prince of tavern tales. In his place stood a ruler of precision and restraint. He dismissed corrupt advisers, reformed the royal finances, and sought counsel from men of learning as much as from soldiers. He spoke with clarity, moved with discipline, and prayed with sincerity. When a conspiracy was uncovered early in his reign, led by nobles who still dreamt of the fallen Richard, Henry faced them not with fury, but with an unflinching sense of duty. The executions that followed were swift and just. Even his enemies admitted he was fair. To the people, this was something new, a monarch both strong and righteous. England, weary of disorder, began to believe again. Farmers returned to their fields, merchants reopened their shops, and sermons once again spoke of unity under God's chosen king. For the first time in years, the realm began to feel whole. Yet peace at home was not the end Henry sought. His eyes turned beyond the Channel to the kingdom of France, where the old Plantagenet claim to the French crown still smoldered like an unextinguished fire. But before that fire would rise, there had to be faith. Henry believed his cause was not ambition but providence. To him, the realm's wounds, his father's sins, the doubt of his lineage, all pointed toward a single purpose. If he could prove himself on the field of God's judgment, if he could bring victory not for conquest but for order, then his house would be purified and his reign made holy. He spent long nights in prayer, reading the Psalms by candlelight, asking for guidance. Those who served him noted that he sought not omens of triumph, but signs of righteousness. "Not unto us, O Lord, but unto thy name give glory," he would murmur, words that would one day echo across the mud of France. In his discipline lay the power that England had forgotten. He rose early, trained with his soldiers, learned the craft of ships and siege engines, studied law and scripture alike. His leadership was not born of charm, but of conviction. And yet, even in his new majesty, he never forgot the common touch. When he walked among the people, he spoke simply, listened carefully, and smiled rarely, but sincerely. The taverns that once mocked him began to tell new stories of a king who remembered the faces of men who had once shared his bread. The legend of good King Harry began to form, not from myth, but from the daily proof of his humility. Still, beneath the calm surface of his reign, destiny stirred. France was divided, its king lost to madness, its nobles at war with one another. The opportunity was clear to every statesman in London. The dream of reclaiming the lands once held by Edward III whispered through the halls of Westminster. For some, it was greed. For Henry, it was absolution. If he could unite his kingdom behind a sacred cause, if victory could sanctify the crown, then perhaps England's past could finally be cleansed. One evening, as he stood in the great hall of Westminster, Henry paused before an ancient tapestry depicting the triumphs of his forefathers in France. The woven gold was faded, the colors worn by time, but the image still glowed faintly in the firelight. Knights beneath banners, the lilies of France bowed before the lions of England. He gazed at it for a long moment, his face unreadable. The courtiers who passed behind him did not hear what he whispered, but those nearby said his voice was steady, almost prayerful. "It is not glory I seek, but purpose." Outside, the night wind moved across the Thames carrying the first rumors of war. Before long, that wind would fill the sails of England's fleet. The prince who had once wandered the taverns would lead men across the sea to a field called Agincourt, where mud and rain would test the weight of faith itself. But for now, in the silence of Westminster, the young king simply watched the light fade across the old tapestry and understood that his true reign had only just begun. Centuries later, the story of Henry I would live on, not because he conquered, but because he believed. In every age, there comes a moment when a nation, a leader, or a soul must rise from its shadows and prove worthy of its inheritance. Henry's journey from recklessness to reverence reminds us that redemption is never a gift. It is earned through the quiet strength to do what is right, even when no one believes. His crown began as a question and ended as a conviction. And though the mist of London long ago drifted into history, the echo of that conviction still lingers. To rule is not to possess power, but to serve something greater than oneself. The first months of Henry's reign were marked not by conquest, but by cleansing. The new king understood that before he could look outward, he had to purify what was within. The kingdom his father left behind was like an old fortress, still standing, but filled with cracks. Greed had found its way into every corner of the court. Justice, once the pride of English law, had become a coin traded by those in power. And so Henry began his reign not with celebration, but with correction. He moved quietly, deliberately. The courtiers who had grown used to privilege found themselves summoned to answer for their deeds. Offices were restructured, bribes rejected, false accounts exposed. Henry was not driven by rage, but by conviction. He spoke often of a kingdom governed by conscience, not convenience. To him, the throne was not a shield from sin, but a pulpit for reform. Each decision carried weight. He dismissed men who had served the previous reign faithfully, yet dishonestly, and replaced them with those of integrity, regardless of rank. Chroniclers wrote that he chose virtue above kin and service above flattery. Those who had once mocked the young prince now saw a man transformed, precise in speech, merciful in tone, but immovable in principle. In the royal courts, the first signs of renewal appeared. Laws long neglected were revived. Petitions from the poor, once ignored, began to reach the king's table. Henry sat through long councils with patience, hearing grievances from commoners and nobles alike. His scribes recorded that he listened as one who must one day answer to God for the people's suffering. Yet even as he sought justice, he understood its cost. A ruler who reclaims order must also face the shadows it exposes. Corruption, like rot in a beam, cannot be cut away without weakening the structure. Among the nobles, murmurs began to rise that the king's zeal for purity threatened the balance of power. Some whispered that he sought not reform, but control. It was in this climate of quiet tension that the first great test of Henry's rule would come, not from abroad, but from within. Summer of 1415. The air in Southampton was heavy with salt and secrecy. The king's fleet lay anchored, ready to sail for France. But beneath the surface of preparation, another plot was unfolding. A group of high-born men, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, Henry, Lord Scrope of Masham, and Sir Thomas Grey, had conspired to overthrow the king before his army could depart. Their goal was to restore the line of Richard II through Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, whose claim by blood was older than Henry's. It was treason cloaked in loyalty, and it cut close to the king's heart. For Scrope was no stranger to him. He had been his friend, his counselor, even his companion in prayer. When the plot was uncovered, Henry's first reaction was disbelief, but the evidence was undeniable. Letters, oaths, and promises of reward from the French crown itself. The trial was swift. The accused were brought before the king in a small chamber, the sound of gulls echoing from the sea outside. Witnesses later said that Henry spoke not as a judge, but as a man wounded by betrayal. He looked upon Scrope and said softly, "If it were only my life they sought, I could forgive, but they strike at England herself." There was no anger in his tone, only sorrow, yet duty left no room for sentiment. The conspirators confessed, and sentence was passed. On the morning of August 5th, they were taken to the field outside the town. Henry did not watch. He withdrew to his tent, where he remained in silence until the bells tolled. The chroniclers wrote that when he emerged, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "Justice has been done," he said, "and may God forgive us all." It was the moment when the man of faith became the man of state. The king who could weep for a friend had also learned to rule without favor. England, watching, began to understand that its new monarch's compassion was bound by conscience, not weakness. The Southampton plot, as it came to be known, became the moral cornerstone of Henry's rule. It was not the cruelty of punishment that defined it, but the integrity of decision. A ruler who placed country above comfort, principle above friendship. To his subjects, it was a warning that the kingdom was sacred ground, and betrayal of it would be judged not merely by law, but by heaven itself. In the months that followed, the realm seemed to breathe more freely. The whispers of conspiracy faded. Order returned to the royal court. Diplomats wrote of a king whose justice was as bright as his sword, but Henry's vision reached further than the shores of England. His mind was drawn to something larger, a destiny woven from both history and faith. The medieval world was still shaped by the memory of crusades, by the belief that kings were instruments of divine will. To Henry, that faith was not a relic, but a calling. He had been raised on the chronicles of Edward III, his great-grandfather, whose victories in France had once made England the envy of Europe. But where Edward had fought for glory, Henry would fight for grace. He saw his mission not as conquest, but restoration, to reclaim not only lost lands, but the moral order of Christendom. In his letters and speeches, he spoke of God's justice in war and the redemption of England's honor. His advisors, more pragmatic, spoke of trade routes, taxation, and political advantage. Henry listened, but his eyes saw further. For him, the war to come would be more than a campaign. It would be a pilgrimage. He believed deeply in the doctrine of divine right, not as license, but as responsibility. A king, he said, must answer to no man but God, and therefore must act as if every act were judged from heaven. "The sword is lent to me," he once told his council, "and I must wield it as his servant, not as my own." Those who knew him said that even in strategy meetings, he would pause to pray before giving a command. His sense of purpose radiated through his court. Priests and scholars began to speak of the king as chosen for a holy task. Prophecies circulated in London that England would be lifted to greatness under a lion crowned with light. The sermons that once mourned the corruption of the age now praised the dawn of renewal. But Henry's understanding of holiness was never naive. He knew that divine favor had to be earned through discipline. Before embarking for France, he issued orders that his army be kept chaste, his officers honest, his soldiers forbidden from looting or abusing civilians. "We go not as conquerors," he declared, "but as instruments of justice." He spent days in preparation not only for battle, but for confession. Each night, he visited the chapel within the camp, kneeling alone before the crucifix. He prayed not for victory, but for righteousness. When he rose, his expression bore the calm of a man who had made peace with both God and history. Around him, England began to stir with a new kind of pride, not loud or boastful, but solemn and united. The banners of St. George unfurled across the harbors. The longbows were strung and blessed by priests. The old divisions between North and South, noble and common, seemed to fade beneath the sense that something larger was at hand. It was as if the entire realm had taken a single breath, preparing to cross a threshold between memory and destiny. For Henry, the war that awaited across the Channel was not merely about territory or vengeance. It was about healing the fracture left by his father's crown. If victory could be won through discipline and faith, then England would be redeemed, and the sin of usurpation erased by the grace of divine triumph. The chroniclers of his court began to describe his planned campaign in the language of the Crusades, the reclaiming of rightful inheritance under the will of God. In his private writings, fragments of which survive, Henry's words reveal the burden of this vision. "We are but servants of the eternal," he wrote, "and yet the world judges us by the fields we conquer. Let our conquest be of ourselves first, lest our triumph turn to dust." It was not the prayer of a conqueror, but of a pilgrim who feared his own pride more than defeat. As the summer of 1415 ripened into autumn, preparations for war consumed the kingdom. Smithies rang through the night, ships were loaded with arrows and grain, and preachers moved through towns, blessing the soldiers who would soon depart. The fever of purpose spread, half sacred, half patriotic. Even those who doubted the campaign's necessity could not deny the aura of destiny surrounding it. On the eve of departure, Henry addressed his army in a quiet field near Southampton. The sea mist hung low, and the scent of salt mixed with smoke from the campfires. He spoke not as a general, but as a shepherd. He reminded them that they carried not only their swords, but the prayers of a nation. "We are one body," he told them, "and God is our head. Let none among us dishonor the name we bear." The soldiers answered with a murmur of assent that rolled through the ranks like the rising of a tide. When dawn came, the sun burned through the mist, lighting the sails in the harbor. The ships stood ready, their flags snapping in the wind. Henry looked out across the waters toward the unseen coast of France. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the field where his destiny would be written. He crossed himself, his lips moving in a prayer no one heard. Then, turning to his captains, he gave the simple order that would set the course of history: "Set sail." And with that, the age of doubt gave way to the age of faith. A kingdom united under one purpose, a king guided by conscience, and a fleet moving steadily toward the storm that would define them all. The wind that filled the English sails carried not only the scent of salt and rain, but the weight of a dream that had begun long before Henry III was born. Across the narrow sea lay the kingdom of France, a land divided, rich and wounded, where chaos had become a way of life. To Henry, it was not merely a neighbor, it was a mirror of what England might become if faith and order were ever lost again. But beyond that reflection lay an inheritance, a crown that he believed was rightfully his by both lineage and destiny. The claim was old, tangled in bloodlines and politics. Through his great-grandfather, Edward III, Henry traced descent from Isabella of France, daughter of Philip Thar of the Valois line. When the last of the direct Capetian kings died without a male heir, Edward III had once asserted his right to the French throne, sparking the long and bitter 100 Years' War. Though generations had passed, the question of legitimacy had never been settled. The French insisted that their law forbade succession through the female line. The English argued that blood, not gender, determined divine right. To most kings, that dispute had become a relic of the past. To Henry, it was unfinished scripture. The crown of France was more than gold and jewels. It was the key to restoring the honor of England and the grace of God upon his house. "If my right be true," he once said, "then I must either claim it or confess I am unworthy of my crown in England." It was not ambition that drove him, but conviction. He sought not to expand an empire, but to complete a circle of history broken by sin and doubt. Yet before he could act, he studied. For months after taking the throne, Henry immersed himself in charters, genealogies, and treaties. He listened to lawyers, theologians, and diplomats until the case became as sacred to him as Scripture. Then, with a clarity that left no space for hesitation, he decided England would reclaim its ancient right. But across the Channel, France was unraveling. King Charles VI, once proud and cultivated, had fallen into madness. At times, he forgot his own name. At others, he wandered the palace halls, believing himself made of glass. The court split around him, each faction claiming to serve the crown while serving itself. On one side stood the Armagnacs, loyal to the queen and the royal heir, the Dauphin. On the other were the Burgundians, led by the cunning Duke of Burgundy, whose ambitions stretched from Flanders to Paris. Their rivalry turned cities into battlefields and provinces into ruins. To the people, it felt as though France had lost its soul. Peasants feared both armies alike. Merchants closed their shops. Roads between towns became dangerous paths patrolled by desperate men. In Paris, mobs rioted over bread and loyalty in equal measure. The very idea of a united France seemed to flicker like a dying flame. Henry watched this disintegration with both caution and purpose. He knew that division was opportunity, but he also knew that chaos was a curse that could consume conqueror and conquered alike. What he sought was not a broken France, but a redeemed one, under one crown, one law, one God. To his mind, that crown should rest upon his head. He sent envoys first, not armies. The message was stern but diplomatic. England would assert its claim to the French throne, but was willing to accept a peaceful settlement if France would recognize the English right and cede certain territories. To emphasize his sincerity, he offered to marry Catherine, the daughter of Charles VI, as a gesture of unity between the two kingdoms. For months, negotiations twisted like vines around a dead tree. The French courtiers divided among themselves, alternated between flattery and delay. Some mocked the English claim as arrogance. Others, fearful of Henry's reputation, urged compromise. But behind the polite words, contempt simmered. Many in the French court saw Henry not as a rightful heir, but as the son of a usurper, a parvenu prince who wore a crown taken by rebellion. Then came the insult that history would never forget. One gray morning in Westminster, a delegation from France was admitted to the royal presence. They bowed deeply, presented letters sealed with blue wax, and then, almost ceremoniously, laid before the king a chest. Inside it was a single gift, a set of gilded tennis balls. The message was clear, a reminder of the stories of Prince Hal, the tavern youth who had wasted his days in sport. "Let him play with these," the French envoy said, "for such is more fit for him than the game of kings." The court gasped, uncertain whether to laugh or tremble. Henry, however, said nothing for a moment. His eyes lingered on the polished spheres, their surface reflecting the firelight like tiny suns. Then, with the calm of a man who had already measured his answer, he spoke. "Tell your masters that when we next play, the balls they have sent shall be struck into the walls of their strongest towns." The envoys bowed stiffly, retreating in silence. Those who watched swore they saw no anger in Henry's face, only the serenity of purpose. The insult had not provoked him, it had confirmed him. In that instant, war ceased to be an option. It became an oath. The months that followed were a storm of preparation. The navy expanded, forges blazed, and the countryside buzzed with mustering orders. Yet, even in the fever of military readiness, Henry's demeanor remained devotional. He ordered public fasts and prayers, commanding that churches throughout the realm hold daily services for the unity of Christendom and the righteousness of our cause. To the chroniclers, it seemed as though the kingdom itself was being consecrated for war. When Parliament convened in the early months of 1415, the hall was filled with anticipation. The great lords came robed in crimson, bishops in white, and commoners in their best wool. The air was thick with candle smoke and expectancy. Henry entered without fanfare, carrying no sword, wearing no crown, only the simple robe of state and the sign of the cross at his breast. He stood before them, and the room fell silent. His speech, later recorded by scribes, was part theology, part call to arms. He spoke not of vengeance or pride, but of duty. France, he said, had broken the peace, withheld England's rightful inheritance, and mocked divine justice. "We stand not against a people, but against the sin that divides us. Let God decide between us and them." The words struck like prayer. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads. Even the skeptical were moved. It was not the rhetoric of a warlord, it was the sermon of a king. When he finished, he knelt where he stood, and the entire assembly rose to their feet as one, voices joining in a single response. Amen. The decision was made, not by decree, but by faith. Soon afterward, the proclamations went out across the realm. Men were called to arms, ships readied in every port. Yet the campaign that Henry envisioned was unlike any other in living memory. He forbade pillage, commanded fairness in pay, and required his captains to swear an oath of mercy toward the innocent. "The sword of the Lord must be clean," he wrote, "for we serve the author of peace, not of confusion." To the common folk, the call to war felt less like a summons and more like a crusade. Priests blessed the longbows. Mothers sent their sons with crosses sewn onto their tunics. Ballads began to circulate of Harry the Just, the king who would restore England's honor and heal the wounds of Christendom. Meanwhile, in France, news of the coming storm divided opinion. The Armagnacs saw Henry's advance as an opportunity to rally the nation against an invader. The Burgundians, less certain, saw advantage in his cause. Some even whispered that if Henry succeeded, France might at last find peace under a single rational crown. But such whispers were drowned by pride. The Dauphin's court ridiculed the English, calling them archers and monks. Few among them remembered that such men had humbled knights before. By midsummer, the die was cast. The English fleet assembled at Southampton, hundreds of ships rocking in the harbor. From the decks, banners fluttered, the Lions of England, the Cross of St. George, and the royal standard bearing the fleur-de-lis entwined with the crown. Henry walked the shore at dawn, his cloak rippling in the wind, his gaze fixed on the horizon. To those who greeted him, he spoke little. His chaplain later wrote that the king's silence was the silence of a man who listens to God. Before departure, he entered the chapel, where his officers knelt beside him. The sea roared faintly outside as he prayed aloud. Lord, judge between us and our adversaries. Let not pride guide our hands, but justice. If our cause be false, strike it down. But if it be true, then bless our endeavor. When he rose, the first rays of sunlight touched the water. Trumpets sounded. The king mounted his ship, the Trinity Royal, and as the sails filled, the wind carried the echo of his final words to those on the shore. God will decide between us and them. And so began the most improbable campaign of the age, a war declared not in fury, but in faith, born from prayer, sharpened by purpose, and destined to echo across the centuries as the march of a man who sought both crown and salvation in a single breath. The harbor at Southampton stirred awake under a pale veil of morning mist. The tide crept up against the wooden piers with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the sea itself hesitated to take part in what was about to begin. Across the water, the English fleet stretched in quiet majesty. More than 1,000 ships, their masts rising like a forest of crosses, banners snapping in the wind. The air was heavy with the scent of tar, rope, and prayer. Henry stood on the deck of the Trinity Royal, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed toward the horizon. He had not slept much the night before. Around him, the sounds of preparation filled the dawn, the creak of rigging, the shouts of officers, the distant clang of smiths at work on the shore. It was August 11th, 1415, and after months of planning, the Kingdom of England was finally setting out to test both heaven and history. Trumpets sounded along the pier. The last supplies were loaded, barrels of salted meat, casks of water and ale, bundles of arrows fletched with goose feathers. Priests moved between the ranks, blessing the soldiers and sprinkling them with holy water that mingled with the sea spray. The ships groaned under their weight. Men, horses, siege engines, hope. As the tide turned, the command was given. Sails unfurled like wings, and the fleet began to move, slow at first, then gathering grace. From the shore, the onlookers watched as the royal standard rose above Henry's ship, the lions of England intertwined with the lilies of France, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. The chroniclers would later write that it seemed as though the whole realm itself was breathing out. The voyage was swift but uneasy. The English Channel, calm in appearance, hid its own moods. Rain fell in sudden bursts, drenching the decks and blurring the horizon. The soldiers slept where they could, packed shoulder to shoulder, lulled by the groan of timber and the hiss of the wind. They spoke in low voices about what awaited them, a mighty fortress called Harfleur, and beyond it, the vastness of France. Some imagined glory, others simply survival. Henry moved among them often, quiet and observant. He ate the same rations, shared the same cramped quarters, and spoke words of resolve more through presence than speech. To many, it was this humility, this refusal to set himself apart, that transformed their fear into loyalty. He was one of us, a bowman later said, but touched by heaven. After 6 days at sea, the fleet sighted the coast of Normandy. Morning fog lifted to reveal rolling dunes, green fields, and in the distance the stone towers of Harfleur, the key to the Seine estuary, gateway to Rouen and Paris beyond. The harbor was well defended, its walls lined with cannon and archers. The French garrison within was seasoned and confident. They had heard rumors of the English fleet, but dismissed it as yet another northern raid. On August 14th, the ships dropped anchor. The invasion of France had begun. The landing was methodical, almost reverent. Henry insisted that no house be plundered, no field trampled. He reminded his captains that they came as soldiers of justice, not of greed. The troops disembarked under a gray sky, setting up camp along the coast. The sea behind them shimmered like a shield of glass, while before them the walls of Harfleur stood like a challenge from God. The siege began 2 days later. Harfleur, situated at the mouth of the Seine, was one of Normandy's strongest fortresses. Thick ramparts, deep moats, and a garrison of over 2,000 men. Henry divided his forces carefully, placing the Duke of Gloucester on one flank and the Duke of Clarence on the other, while he himself took command at the center. From the start, the assault was as much an act of endurance as of strategy. The English set up their siege guns, primitive but effective, great bombards that hurled stone balls against the walls with thunderous sound. Each strike sent echoes rolling across the countryside. Days turned into weeks. The ground trembled, the air grew thick with dust, and yet the city held. Inside the English camp, conditions worsened. The summer heat brought stench and sickness. Water ran low, food spoiled quickly. The damp trenches became breeding grounds for disease. Men fell ill by the dozens, their strength drained by fever and dysentery. Henry himself walked among the tents, his cloak drawn tight, visiting the sick, speaking softly, assuring them that their suffering was not in vain. He ordered fresh supplies from the ships, clean straw for bedding, and prayers at every dawn. "Let no man despair," he told his officers. "We fight not for conquest, but for cleansing." The French defenders, seeing the English struggle, mocked them from the ramparts. They shouted insults, rang bells, and fired arrows at night to rob the besiegers of rest. Still, Henry would not retreat. He tightened the cordon around the town, cutting off all supplies. When negotiations were offered, he refused easy compromise. He demanded full surrender, promising mercy but no leniency. On the morning of September 18th, after more than a month of siege, the king gathered his captains. The English lines were weary, the men gaunt and hollow-eyed, yet the determination that burned in their hearts was fiercer than ever. Standing before them, Henry spoke, not as a monarch, but as one among them. "We are not here for plunder," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "We are here to prove that faith and courage can rebuild what corruption has broken. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English hearts, for in this act lies not our fortune, but our honor." The words moved through the ranks like fire. Archers gripped their bows tighter, men-at-arms adjusted their helmets. It was not a shout that followed, but a quiet resolve, the sound of belief taking form. When the signal came, the English advanced, storming the outer gate under cover of arrows and smoke. The walls shook. After hours of fierce exchange, a breach opened in the lower fortifications. Henry, sword raised, high, urged his men forward. The king himself stood at the front, not striking but guiding, a figure of unyielding purpose in the chaos. By evening, the defenders' will began to falter. Fires burned within the town, and the bells of harfleur rang, not in defiance, but in desperation. On September 22nd, after 5 weeks of siege, the French commander finally sent envoys under a white flag. They offered surrender on terms of honor. Henry accepted. He entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a steward. He forbade looting, protected the churches, and ordered food distributed to the starving civilians. He appointed English governors to restore order, but allowed the townspeople to remain in their homes. His first act within the captured city was to hold a mass of thanksgiving. Standing before the altar, he removed his helmet, knelt, and whispered, "Not to us, O Lord, but to thy name give glory." But even in victory the price was clear. The English army was ravaged by illness. Hundreds lay sick in their tents. Many more were too weak to march. The damp Norman air, the fetid water, the long strain of siege, all had taken their toll. The king's triumph, though righteous, was shadowed by exhaustion. The chroniclers tell of the silence that fell over the camp once Harfleur surrendered. The men were too spent to cheer. They buried their dead quietly, mended their armor, and waited for the king's next command. Henry walked among them at dusk, his face grave, his hands clasped behind his back. "This," he murmured, "is the cost of justice." He knew the campaign could not end there. To turn back would mean defeat of the spirit, yet to advance was to tempt ruin. Still, the choice was made. Calais lay to the north, a safe haven held by the English for half a century, reachable by a long march through enemy territory. It would be dangerous, uncertain, perhaps impossible, but Henry would go. "Better to die moving forward," he said, "than live doubting the cause." Before leaving Harfleur, he issued one final order. The sick and wounded were to be left under the care of a garrison, treated with the same mercy as the citizens. Those strong enough to travel were to march lightly, carrying only what they could bear. As the army prepared to depart, Henry climbed the battlements one last time. The wind off the Seine carried the scent of smoke and sea. Below him, the city he had taken stood still, its people emerging from their homes to watch the English banners flutter. He closed his eyes, offering a final prayer, not for triumph, but for endurance. Then he descended, mounted his horse, and gave the signal. The gates of Harfleur opened, and the weary host began its long march northward. Behind them, the church bells tolled in solemn rhythm, neither victory nor lament, but something in between. Ahead of them stretched the wide, uncertain road to Calais, and beyond that, the fields of destiny waiting in silence. The siege of Harfleur had been won, but the war for Henry's soul and for the future of England had only just begun. The rain began before dawn, soft at first, then relentless. It fell in sheets across the Norman countryside, turning roads into rivers and fields into seas of mud. The English army, weary from the siege of Harfleur, moved northward like a ghostly procession, thousands of men trudging through gray water under a sky without color. Their banners drooped, their armor dulled, their boots sank deep into the mire. Yet still they marched. Henry rode at the front, not beneath a canopy or gilded saddle, but wrapped in a plain cloak soaked through with rain. His horse stumbled often on the churned earth, but he did not complain. Around him, men coughed and shivered, their faces pale from hunger and fever. Supplies had been left behind at Harfleur. Wagons broke in the mud. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Bread grew scarce, water fouled, and the air stank of sickness and fatigue. Every mile felt heavier than the last. Still, the king refused to turn back. Each night, when the soldiers set up camp amid wet fields and dripping tents, Henry walked among them, speaking softly, asking after their wounds, sharing what little food he had. Chroniclers wrote that he slept where they slept, ate as they ate, and prayed as they prayed. At times he sat by the fires, though most had only smoke and damp wood to offer, and spoke of home, of the fields of England, of the honor of standing together beneath God's eye. He told them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to walk through it. Some men wept quietly, others smiled through cracked lips. They saw in him not a distant monarch, but a comrade, a man who carried the same burden they did, only higher. By day, the rain followed them. The land of Normandy stretched endlessly, rivers swollen, bridges washed away, villages abandoned at the sight of their banners. The king forbade plunder, and so the army survived on whatever they could find. Berries, stale bread, a few head of cattle purchased with coin or promises. The discipline he demanded was almost impossible, yet it held. For Henry's example was stronger than any threat of punishment. At one point, as the army struggled through a particularly deep stretch of mud, the Duke of Gloucester, Henry's younger brother, fell behind. His horse, spent and trembling, could go no farther. The king turned back, dismounted, and helped free the animal himself, his cloak spattered and torn. "If the brother of the king walks," Henry said, "then every man may do the same." Word of the act spread through the ranks like fire in dry grass. From that day on, none dared complain within the king's hearing, but the hardship grew worse. The autumn rains did not cease. Blisters opened on feet. Fever spread. Rations dwindled to crumbs. Men began to faint on the march, collapsing into the mud, only to be lifted by their comrades. Yet, for all their suffering, the army remained orderly, even solemn. It was as though the trials themselves had become a kind of communion. Pain shared was faith renewed. The priests who traveled with them said Mass each morning, their voices nearly drowned by wind. Henry knelt always at the front, his head bowed, lips moving silently in prayer. Some nights, when the clouds parted, the soldiers saw him standing alone under the stars, staring toward the north as if he could already see the road to Calais. Rumors traveled faster than armies. Even as Henry led his weary host through the countryside, France had begun to stir. Scouts reported that the Armagnac faction had called the nobility to arms. Across the valleys and towns, banners were raised, the lilies of France, the crosses of the great houses, the personal crests of knights who sought honor or vengeance. By early October, more than 20,000 French troops were gathering near Rouen, led by some of the most powerful lords in the realm. News of this reached Henry's camp on a gray morning when the rain had at last subsided. The message was simple, written on damp parchment. The whole of France moves against you. The council of war met that evening beneath a canopy patched with holes. The king's captains urged retreat. The army was sick, outnumbered 5-1, hemmed in by swollen rivers and enemy patrols. The safest course, they argued, was to fall back to Harfleur, reboard the ships, and return home in triumph rather than ruin. Henry listened, his expression calm. The fire between them hissed and smoked. When they had finished, he looked around the circle, at the faces drawn thin by fatigue, at the eyes that waited for his word. "My lords," he said quietly, "if we turn back now, we return not in triumph, but in shame. We came here not for conquest, but for cause, and the cause is not yet proved. We have taken a city, yes, but we have not yet tested our souls. Let it not be said that England fled from the will of God." He paused, letting the rain patter softly on the canvas above. "We march to Calais," he declared. "If France meets us on the road, so be it. We will go home by honor, or not at all." No one spoke after that. They all knew what it meant. The next morning, the army moved again, slow, determined, like pilgrims walking through history. The landscape changed as they advanced, from rolling meadows to dark woods, from narrow valleys to wide plains where the sky itself seemed to press down upon them. Everywhere they went, signs of the French buildup were evident. Burned villages, fresh tracks of cavalry, fields stripped of grain. Scouts brought reports daily. Enemy horsemen shadowed them from afar, watching, waiting. The French forces, now numbering more than 20,000, were closing in from the south and west, blocking every road to Calais. The English, fewer than 9,000, continued their march. Henry's discipline never faltered. Each morning he rode the lines, his armor dulled by the constant rain, his voice steady as he gave orders. He reminded the men to keep formation, to share food, to carry their wounded. He punished theft, but rewarded compassion. "We are one body," he told them again and again, "and no part shall fail if the heart remains true." At night, by the faint glow of campfires, he read scripture aloud, psalms of endurance, verses of faith. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow," he recited, "I will fear no evil." His men listened in silence, the words sinking deeper than any command. One evening, near the village of Picquigny, a sudden downpour forced the army to halt. The ground turned instantly to mire. Henry ordered his tent left unraised. He walked among the soldiers and lay down with them on the soaked earth, using his cloak for cover. When dawn broke, those who woke near him saw the king's armor streaked with mud, his hair plastered to his brow. Yet when he rose, he smiled faintly and said, "The ground is hard, but God is firm beneath it." That day, the army marched farther than ever before. By mid-October, the rain began to ease, but the danger grew. The French army, vast and confident, had now crossed the Somme and blocked every ford. Their intention was clear: trap Henry's army far from Calais, cut off its retreat, and destroy it. Henry's scouts brought word that the enemy was near, 20,000 strong, led by the Constable of France, the Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon, and Alençon. Their armor gleamed, their horses were fresh. In comparison, the English looked like shadows, thin, pale, their clothes in tatters. That night, in the quiet before sleep, the king called his captains once more. Around the small fire, their faces flickered with orange light. Henry's voice was calm, almost gentle. "My friends," he said, "we are surrounded, but not defeated. The Lord has placed us where faith must stand or fall. Our enemy has numbers, but we have purpose. Remember this: no man dies who fights for what is right in the eyes of God." He looked into the flames for a long moment, then added softly, "Tomorrow we march on, and if I never see England again, let it be said that I went forward as her servant, not her master." The men bowed their heads. There was no cheer, no rallying cry, only the sound of rain beginning again on the canvas roof, steady and relentless. When morning came, the sky was low and gray. The soldiers rose in silence, tightened the straps of their armor, and took up their weapons. Ahead lay the road to Calais, narrow and uncertain. Behind them, the French army closed like a storm. Henry mounted his horse and looked back once at the distant hills. "We go on," he said simply. And with that, the weary army began its march into the heart of enemy land, toward a place that none yet knew by name, a place that would soon be written into legend. Agincourt. The march through, rain and ruin had brought them here, to this narrow, muddy plain between two dark woods. Every step through Normandy, every prayer whispered under storm-torn skies, had been leading toward this dawn. The hunger, the sickness, the endless rain, all of it had forged them for this single test. As Henry looked upon the field before him, shrouded in mist and silence, he seemed to sense it. That history itself was holding its breath. Behind him trudged the same men who had followed him from harfleur, their faces drawn, their boots heavy with mud, their spirits worn thin yet unbroken. Ahead lay the French host, vast and glittering, waiting like a storm about to break. The long march was over, the trial of endurance had become the eve of destiny, and as the first gray light touched the horizon, King Henry V drew a slow breath and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for courage. The rain had ceased, but the earth still held its memory. The air was thick, the ground unsteady, and the hearts of men trembled between fear and faith. Then, as the dawn of October 25th, 1415 began to rise, the fog of Agincourt closed in, and England's weary army prepared to stand its ground. The dawn of October 25th, 1415, rose not with triumph, but with fog. A cold mist clung to the fields of Agincourt, swallowing sound and distance alike. The night's rain had turned the earth into a swamp of churned mud and trampled stalks. Across that sodden expanse, no more than a few hundred yards wide, two armies faced one another in silence. One vast, resplendent, glittering in steel and heraldry. The other small, worn, and quiet, its armor dulled, its banners frayed. The French army numbered more than 20,000. Knights of the highest birth, dukes, counts, barons, had gathered to end this invasion once and for all. Their horses snorted in the mist, restless beneath silken caparisons. They laughed, some certain that victory would come easily. The English, after all, were exhausted, sick, and outnumbered 5-1. It seemed the day was already written. But across the field, King Henry V stood among his men, not on a raised platform, not behind his captains, but at their center. His armor was plain, his face pale from fatigue, yet his eyes were clear. Around him, archers drove their stakes into the soft ground, forming lines of defense like a forest of thorns. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. He knew what the odds were. He had prayed through the night, pacing before a small wooden cross planted in the mud. Now, as dawn came creeping through the mist, he gathered his captains, then his soldiers, calling them to hear him speak. What followed would live in memory far longer than any clash of steel. He looked at them, the men who had marched through storm and hunger, who had left home without promise of return. He spoke softly at first, his voice low and steady, cutting through the fog like a candle flame. "This day," he said, "is called the Feast of St. Crispin. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand upon tiptoe when this day is named and rouse him at the name of Crispin." The men listened, motionless. The mist swirled around him, turning his words into something larger than sound. "He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, 'Tomorrow is St. Crispin's day.' Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, 'These wounds I had on Crispin's day.'" He paused, not for effect, but for breath. He knew his men's weariness. He saw their fear and chose not to deny it, but to transform it. "This story shall the good man teach his son," he continued, his voice rising. "And Crispian shall ne'er go by, from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." A silence followed, deep and trembling. Then the murmurs began, quiet at first, then growing. Men turned to one another, eyes glinting. "We few," they whispered, "we band of brothers." In that moment, the army became one. No longer lords and yeomen, knights and archers, but a single will bound by faith and necessity. The fog lifted slightly, revealing the French lines across the narrow field, their banners catching the first light of dawn. Henry raised his sword, the blade reflecting a thin streak of sunrise through the mist. "God be with us all," he said simply. And then the waiting ended. The French advanced first, confident, their trumpets blaring across the field. But the ground betrayed them. The narrow strip of farmland between the woods of Agincourt and Tramecourt had been soaked through by days of rain. Horses struggled to move through the thick mud, their hooves sucking at the ground. Henry had chosen his position with care. His army stood on slightly higher ground, flanked by dense forests that funneled the French into a corridor too narrow for their numbers. He placed his longbowmen, the heart of the English army, in wedges along the flanks, their wooden stakes planted before them to repel cavalry. In the center stood his dismounted knights and men-at-arms, packed tight, shields locked, ready to hold the line. As the French knights advanced, the longbows began to sing. Thousands of arrows rose into the sky, a dark, hissing storm. They fell not with fire, but with the whisper of inevitability, slicing through mist and rain. Horses reared, banners dipped, confusion spread. Still the French pressed forward, their sheer mass pushing them toward the English line. But the mud deepened. Armored men stumbled and fell. The weight of steel dragged them down. The momentum that had once carried French chivalry across Europe now turned against them. Henry rode behind his line, shouting encouragement, his voice carrying above the noise. "Hold fast, St. George and Merry England!" The cry echoed across the field, picked up by every throat, until it became not words, but thunder. The archers loosed again and again, their arms aching, their fingers raw, until the air itself seemed alive with feathers and wind. When the French finally reached the English front, their formation had dissolved into chaos. Knights collided, slipping and crashing into one another. The narrow field became a mire of tangled horses and men. Movement slowed to a crawl. Henry saw the moment. He gave the signal. The archers dropped their bows, drew swords and hatchets, and waded forward, joining the melee. The English line surged like a living wall, pushing back against the mass of glittering armor. It was not a battle of elegance, but of endurance. A slow, grinding struggle in which faith and discipline outweighed grandeur. The French tried to rally, sending forward fresh waves, but the mud swallowed them. Their own numbers crushed them in the press. Trumpets faltered, banners vanished into the gray. From the ridge, Henry could see it all. The narrowing corridor, the trapped cavalry, the confusion spreading like smoke. He dismounted, walking among his men, lending his presence where it mattered most. Every gesture, every word carried weight. "Stand firm," he called. "For England, for honor." And still, the arrows fell. By midday, the battle was decided. The field, once green and gold, had turned brown and still. The French advance had broken against the English line like a wave against stone. When at last the trumpet ceased, the fog returned, cloaking the world in silence once more. The aftermath was not triumph, but awe. The English, stunned by what they had endured, stood in disbelief. They had fought against impossible odds and lived. The French, mighty and countless, had fallen not through weakness, but through the turning of fortune and faith. Henry walked through the field slowly, his armor streaked with mud, his steps heavy. Around him lay the wreckage of the morning, toppled banners, overturned horses, broken weapons. He saw no glory in it, only gravity. He reached a small rise where the ground was clear, and there he stopped. Removing his helmet, he looked to the sky, pale and clouded, yet touched by faint light. He knelt in the mud, folded his hands, and whispered, "Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to thy name give the glory." Those nearby followed suit, dropping to their knees. The battlefield fell into reverent quiet, an army praying amid the remnants of what should have been their destruction. When he rose, the king's face was calm, though streaked with dirt and exhaustion. He ordered that the wounded be tended, both English and French. He forbade celebration, commanding instead that a mass of thanksgiving be held at sunset. As the sun dipped behind the distant trees, its light turned the mist to gold. The men stood in silence while priests intoned the words of the psalm. Henry's eyes lingered on the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a single line of color. For a moment, he seemed apart from everything, neither victor nor ruler, but a man who had glimpsed something far greater than himself. That night, when the fires burned low, The soldiers sat quietly, speaking little. The rain began again, gentle, almost kind. In its rhythm they heard not mourning nor triumph, but the steady pulse of survival, the proof that they had lived through a day no one would ever forget. Somewhere beyond the fog, bells tolled faintly from a distant village, the sound of life continuing. Henry listened, then turned to his chaplain and said softly, "So ends the feast of St. Crispin." And so it did, not with shouts or fanfare, but with prayer, a prayer born of endurance, bound in brotherhood, and written forever into the heart of a kingdom that had stood, on that day, between despair and deliverance. The mist of Agincourt had barely settled before a new silence took hold, not the silence of death, but of consequence. The prayers that rose from that blood-soaked field did not end the story. They merely turned its page. For though the arrows had fallen and the banners had stilled, the true weight of victory was yet to be carried. When Henry V left the fields of northern France behind, he carried with him more than triumph. He carried the burden of what that triumph had cost. The humility that had knelt in the mud of Agincourt would now rise to rule from the marble halls of kings. From that day onward, his crown no longer gleamed with the light of conquest, but with the quiet fire of duty. As his ships crossed the gray channel back to England, the roar of the battlefield faded into the murmur of prayer and governance. The warrior became a shepherd once more, guiding not an army, but a nation, toward a peace fragile and sacred, a vision greater than war itself. And so, from the silence of Agincourt's dawn to the solemn bells of Westminster, the story of Henry V entered its next chapter, not written in the mud and mist of battle, but in the parchment and promise of diplomacy. The sword was sheathed, the quill lifted, and destiny began to whisper a new name: Troy. The mist had barely lifted from the fields of Agincourt when a new tension crept into the air, not of battle, but of dread. The French army was broken, scattered across the muddy plain, their banners fallen, their songs silenced. Yet amid the wreckage of victory, a darker question took shape: what to do with the living? Hundreds of French knights and nobles had surrendered, their armor stripped, their swords thrown down. They were valuable men, hostages of immense worth, each one a ransom that could fill the English treasury for years. Among them were dukes, counts, and sons of France's greatest houses. They were prisoners, but not enemies to be despised. Henry knew that. Many of them had fought with honor. He had promised mercy. But war has its own cruel rhythm, one that cares little for vows or conscience. As the morning stretched on, word spread that a second French force might be approaching. Scouts reported movement beyond the hills, banners perhaps, or the shimmer of steel. Whether true or imagined, the fear struck deep. The English army, small and spent, could barely stand another assault. Henry faced the impossible. Behind him lay thousands of captives, more men than his own soldiers could guard. Ahead, perhaps, a renewed enemy. The risk was clear. If the prisoners rose, if they seized weapons, the victory could dissolve in a heartbeat. He withdrew a short distance from the line and stood alone for a long time, head bowed, the cold wind tugging at his cloak. The chroniclers who watched said he looked not like a conqueror, but like a man listening for an answer he did not want to hear. When he returned to his captains, his face was pale, his words steady. "Take the prisoners away," he said. "Do what must be done. God knows my heart." It was not cruelty that spoke, but necessity, the terrible calculus of survival. To protect the living, he condemned those already subdued. And when the order spread through the camp, a silence deeper than grief followed. Men obeyed, though many turned away, unable to meet their king's eyes. Henry himself retreated to the small chapel tent at the edge of the field. There, he knelt before the makeshift altar and prayed for forgiveness, not for victory, but for what victory demanded. History would later judge that decision harshly, but in that moment it was neither vengeance nor malice, only fear, born of duty. And when the danger passed, when it became clear that no second army would come, Henry emerged from the tent as if carrying a weight invisible but immense. He looked over the silent field, over what had been gained and what had been lost. "This," he said softly, "is the price of peace." The sun broke weakly through the clouds then, casting long golden beams across the churned ground. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of bells, faint, uncertain, as though the world itself did not yet know whether to mourn or to rejoice. Days later, the English army began its slow march north toward Calais. The road was lined with broken wagons and abandoned armor, ghosts of the battle they had survived. Yet the men walked with a strange, quiet pride. They were fewer now, lean and hollow-eyed, but they carried something more enduring than spoils. They carried belief. Henry rode among them, his expression calm, though his shoulders seemed heavier with each mile. He rarely spoke. At night he sat by the fires, listening to the soft murmur of psalms drifting across the camp. To his men, he was already something more than mortal. The king chosen by heaven, the one who had led them through hunger, mud, and despair, and returned them to life. Yet Henry himself did not feel divine. He felt human and haunted. When at last they reached the coast, the sight of the sea stirred something deep within him. The gray expanse stretched endless, as though washing away the memory of war. The ships waited like patient beasts, sails furled, ready to carry the weary army home. Henry dismounted, removed his helmet, and stood for a moment in silence. Then he said quietly to those near him, "We came through storm and sword, but not by our strength. Remember that." They sailed with the tide. The journey home was calm, the waves gentle, as if even the sea honored their endurance. When the English coast came into view, the men fell to their knees, some laughing, some weeping. The bells of Dover rang before their anchors even touched the shore. Word of Agincourt had already reached England, carried by ships and rumor, and by miracle. London awoke to celebration. The city's narrow streets bloomed with banners and garlands. Church bells pealed from every spire. Crowds lined the Thames waiting to glimpse the returning king. Children clambered onto rooftops, merchants threw coins into the air. Choirs sang hymns of thanksgiving. For the first time in a generation, England felt whole, united not by conquest or fear, but by faith in itself. When Henry rode through the city gates, there was no pomp in him. His armor was still dulled from the campaign, his cloak plain. He bowed his head as the crowds shouted his name. In his hand he held not a sword, but a simple rosary. The chroniclers record that he refused any triumphal entry. He ordered that no man wear laurel, no trumpet sound, until a mass had been offered. He entered Westminster barefoot, walked down the nave of the great abbey, and knelt before the high altar. The sound of thousands outside grew still as his prayer rose through the vaulted space. "Not to us, O Lord," he murmured again, "but to thy name give the glory." When he rose, the archbishop blessed him before the nation. That evening, bonfires lit every hill from Kent to York, their flames mirrored in rivers and lakes. People sang beneath the stars, telling and retelling the miracle of Agincourt, how a king and an army of weary men had faced the might of France and prevailed. But in the quiet halls of Westminster, Henry sat alone. The noise of rejoicing drifted faintly through the windows, softened by distance. Before him lay the royal crown, resting on a cloth of gold. He looked at it for a long while, then closed his eyes. Victory had come, but peace, the peace he had sought since his father's death, still seemed far away. In the months that followed, Henry became more than a king. He became a symbol. Painters and poets called him the warrior of God, the holy monarch who had fought not for land, but for righteousness. The church hailed him as the defender of faith, the one who had proven that divine favor still rested upon England. Yet those who knew him best saw a quieter truth. They saw the man who still rose before dawn to pray alone, the king who wept in private for the burden of command, the leader who had learned that even the purest cause leaves shadows behind. He spoke seldom of Agincourt. When he did, his words were measured, almost reluctant. "We were but instruments," he told his council. "The victory was the Lord's. The loss, however, was mine." And in that humility, England found its saint, not one carved in marble or painted in gold, but living, breathing, and human. A man who had walked through fire and emerged not unscarred, but purified. Years later, chroniclers would write that Agincourt was not merely a battle, but a parable of courage, of faith, of the strange mercy that lies hidden within suffering. It was the moment when a kingdom, weary and divided, remembered itself. When a king, shaped by doubt and devotion, learned that glory is fleeting, but honor endures. On that autumn morning, in the mud of a foreign field, Henry V had won more than a victory. He had won the right to be remembered, not as a conqueror, but as a man who, in his greatest hour, bowed his head and gave the triumph away. Between the fading cheers of Agincourt and the solemn bells of Westminster, the world around Henry began to change. Victory, once so bright and thunderous, gave way to a quieter, weightier calling, not to conquer, but to heal. The mud of the battlefield was replaced by the marble floors of cathedrals and council halls, where ink and prayer now carried the power once held by sword and shield. As the English ships sailed home through calm seas, carrying weary soldiers and the echoes of their triumph, Henry stood at the edge of the deck, watching the horizon blur between sea and sky. He knew that what awaited him was not rest, but responsibility, for the peace won in France was fragile, and the faith of nations more delicate still. The celebrations that greeted him in London could not drown the thought already stirring in his mind. The work was not finished. The banners, the bonfires, the hymns, all were fleeting. What mattered now was to turn glory into order, to bind what war had broken, and to seek through diplomacy what could no longer be gained through arms. And so, as the jubilation faded into the solemn rhythm of governance, the warrior became a statesman. His gaze shifted from the muddy plains of Picardy to the shadowed chambers of French politics. He had won battles. Now he must win hearts. Thus began the road to Troy, a road not paved with triumph, but with patience. A road where Henry V, the conqueror of Agincourt, would trade the roar of war for the whisper of negotiation, and where the fate of kingdoms would be written not in blood, but in ink. The years after Agincourt unfolded like the slow exhalation after a storm. The glory of the battlefield gave way to the weight of rule, and Henry V, no longer just a commander, became a statesman bound to the destiny of two kingdoms. France lay fractured, its nobility divided, its king lost in madness. England, for the first time in generations, felt the pulse of triumph, but also the lure of something greater, a union of crowns beneath one faith, one monarch, one God. The winter of 1419 bled into a spring of fragile diplomacy. Across the Channel, the French court was a theater of intrigue, the Armagnacs and Burgundians tearing each other apart, while the English advanced through Normandy, taking one stronghold after another. Henry marched not only with armies now, but with the steady patience of a ruler who understood that steel could conquer land, but only words could conquer hearts. And so, the road led to Troy. The city, nestled in the heart of Champagne, became a place where destiny and diplomacy met. Its narrow streets, once filled with merchants and monks, now echoed with the clatter of armor and the low murmur of negotiation. Beneath its cathedral spires, three powers prepared to reshape the map of Europe: Henry of England, the Mad King, Charles VI of France, and Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, the man whose allegiance would tip the balance of nations. Charles VI was, by then, a shadow of himself, a ruler who drifted in and out of lucidity, believing at times that he was made of glass. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, guided what remained of the royal will, and her motives, like the times, were divided between survival and salvation. The war had drained France's lifeblood. The people longed for peace, the nobles for stability, and the church for divine order. Henry offered all three. The negotiations were as much liturgy as politics. Latin prayers mingled with the scent of wax and incense. The papal envoys invoked the unity of Christendom, while bishops whispered over parchments bearing seals and crosses. At the heart of it all stood Henry, plain-spoken, resolute, a king who carried himself with the gravity of faith. His terms were astonishing in their boldness. Charles VI would remain king of France for life, but upon his death, the crown would pass not to the Dauphin, disinherited and exiled, but to Henry and his heirs. In exchange, peace would be restored, Burgundy reconciled, and the war, that endless war, finally brought to rest under God's will. It was, in its essence, the vision of a Christendom reunited. England and France joined not by conquest, but by covenant. Yet beneath the solemn oaths and gilded seals, there ran an unspoken truth. This peace was born not of harmony, but but of exhaustion. When the treaty was signed in May of 1420, the bells of Troyes rang as if to announce a new world. By divine providence, the heralds proclaimed, 2 realms are made one. Priests intoned the Te Deum in the great cathedral. Courtiers wept openly. And in that moment, fleeting, luminous, almost unreal, it seemed that the blood of generations might finally yield to the hand of grace. But even in that holy hour, destiny was already shaping its next irony. For while parchment and pen-bound nations, the heart of the king was drawn elsewhere, to the daughter of the realm he had conquered. Catherine of Valois was 19 when she first met Henry. She had grown up in a court haunted by war and madness, a quiet figure amid the chaos of her father's illness and her mother's ambition. Chroniclers described her as fair and reserved, with eyes that carried both innocence and sorrow. Their first encounter was not the meeting of conqueror and captive, but something gentler, 2 people caught between duty and something unexpectedly human. The legend says that Henry, whose French was halting and awkward, attempted to speak to her in her native tongue. His words stumbled, his grammar faltered, and for the first time in years, those around him saw him laugh, not the commanding laugh of a king, but the shy, unguarded laugh of a man who suddenly remembered what tenderness felt like. The princess smiled in return, answering softly, patient with his efforts. A moment of warmth flickered between them. Fragile, almost hesitant, yet unmistakably real. It was as though, amid the cold machinery of politics and power, a door had opened to something simple and human: affection. Their courtship was brief, constrained by ceremony and diplomacy. Yet in those rare hours they shared, walking beneath the cloisters, speaking through interpreters or gestures. A strange balance emerged. She represented France's grace, he, England's strength. Together, they embodied a vision of peace that no treaty alone could hold. One evening, beneath the high vaults of Troyes Cathedral, Henry spoke to her with the earnestness that had moved soldiers and priests alike. "We have made peace between realms," he said softly, "but I would have peace also between hearts." Catherine lowered her gaze, her voice almost a whisper. "My lord, kingdoms may be joined by ink, but hearts must trust." Henry smiled, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for hers. "Then let them learn to trust together." The words, simple as they were, carried the weight of a promise neither could fully understand, that love might for a brief moment bridge the wounds of nations. Their marriage, sealed in the summer of 1420, was celebrated as both a miracle and a prophecy. The cathedral bells of Troy rang again, not for treaties now, but for union. The ceremony shimmered with symbolism, a French princess taking the hand of an English king, 2 nations kneeling before the same altar, the same cross. Chroniclers wrote of sunlight pouring through the stained glass like divine approval, of Henry placing a golden circlet upon her brow and whispering, "God make us one." For a moment, it seemed that he had. When they rode together through the streets, people shouted blessings from the windows. "Long live the peace," they cried. "Long live Henry and Catherine." Children scattered flowers before their horses' hooves. Even the wind seemed to soften. Yet peace is a fragile thing, and love, when bound to power, rarely escapes the shadow of fate. Beneath the splendor of the wedding feasts, beneath the gilded hymns and courtly smiles, the old wounds of Europe still bled quietly. The Dauphin, disinherited and burning with pride, refused to recognize the treaty. In the south, banners still rose in rebellion, and in Henry's own body, the strain of war and years of ceaseless toil began to show. But for now, just for that fleeting summer, the world seemed to pause. Henry, who had known only battlefields and councils, found a kind of peace in the presence of his young queen. Witnesses spoke of the gentleness that settled over him, the way he looked at her, not as the daughter of an enemy, but as the promise of something pure. At night, he would read to her from psalms and prayers, his voice soft and deliberate. She would listen, sometimes reaching out to still his hand. They were not simply monarchs. They were, for a little while, 2 souls in the quiet between wars. In the grand halls of Europe, the Treaty of Troy was hailed as the triumph of divine order, a vision of unity sanctified by marriage. The Pope sent blessings. The clergy praised the holy reconciliation of nations. Painters depicted the moment as a covenant of light, and poets sang that even angels must have smiled. But history, ever patient, knew better. It would remember the tenderness of that union, not as an ending, but as a prelude, for the seeds of tragedy were already sown. Henry's strength was fading, France's peace was built on fracture, and the child of this royal union would inherit not two kingdoms united, but two thrones divided by destiny. For now, though, the world still believed, and as the summer sun set over Troy, the bells of the cathedral echoed one last time across the quiet fields, not as the sound of victory, nor as warning, but as a prayer, that faith might outlast power, and that love, however brief, might yet redeem the crown. The last echoes of Troy's had scarcely faded when the rhythm of Henry's life began to change. What had once been a march of conquest became a quieter, deeper labor, the work of building a realm, of tending what victory had sown. The marriage that had symbolized peace became in time a tender refuge amid the unending demands of rule. Yet beneath the gilded calm of court and covenant, history moved as it always did, onward, patient and unseen, preparing its next turn. The vows spoken beneath the vaulted ceilings of Troy had bound two kingdoms in faith, but faith alone could not still the restlessness of the world, nor of the king himself. As the hymns of celebration faded into the distance, Henry rose once more to the tasks of governance, his gaze already turning from the warmth of marriage toward the weight of mission. The same discipline that had carried him through the breach at Harfleur now guided him through the subtler battles of justice and order. Thus the season of love gave way to the season of duty. The crown that had shone so brightly at Troy now gleamed under the burden of responsibility. For even in peace, Henry felt the pulse of divine calling, the conviction that the sword must serve righteousness, and that the realm, though at rest, must never be complacent. And so, from the vows of Troyes to the halls of Westminster, from the hand of Catherine to the hand of God, the story of Henry V entered its final movement, the quiet, resolute passage from glory to grace. The years that followed Troyes were brief, too brief for a man whose vision had stretched beyond borders and generations. Henry V stood at the height of his power, the crowned heir to both England and France, the unifier of realms under God's name. Yet, as swiftly as his star had risen, its light began to fade. Greatness, it seemed, was never meant to dwell long among mortals. In the months after his marriage to Catherine, Henry ruled with a clarity of purpose that astonished even his rivals. His court, once known for ambition and intrigue, became a place of order and discipline. He reformed the church's revenues, demanding honesty and service from its clergy. He restored justice to the shires, curbing corruption that had spread under previous reigns. In the chronicles of his time, even his enemies admitted that he was a king both feared and beloved. He prayed daily, not for victory or wealth, but for guidance, that the power he wielded might serve righteousness rather than pride. It was said that when disputes arose among his counselors, he would settle them not with threats, but with quiet conviction. If we govern as God commands, he told them, then the realm will stand, even when kings fall. Under his rule, England flourished. The ports of Southampton and Bristol hummed with trade, and the merchants of London prospered. In France, garrisons held firm under his name, their banners bearing both the Lion of England and the fleur-de-lis. The people called him Le Roi Juste, the just king. And for a moment, it seemed as if the long dream of peace, so often broken by blood and ambition, might finally endure. Yet even as his reign reached its zenith, Henry was restless. The war in France, though quieted by treaty, still smoldered in the hearts of men. Bands of loyalists to the Dauphin continued to fight in the south, raiding English garrisons and villages. To Henry, these were not mere rebels. They were a challenge to the divine order he believed had been entrusted to him, and so, once more, he took up arms. In 1421, he led a campaign across the French heartlands, a march of both conquest and conviction. Catherine, then with child, remained behind in England, watched over by his council. Their parting was tender, almost prophetic. She urged him to rest, to let others fight in his stead. But Henry smiled faintly and said, "A king must do as he was anointed to do." The army crossed the Seine in the early spring of 1422, pushing toward the fortified town of Meaux. The city, held by loyalists of the Dauphin, guarded a vital crossing of the Marne. To capture it was to secure France itself. Henry besieged it with his usual precision, methodical, disciplined, unyielding. But the siege dragged on, through heat and rain, through hunger and disease. Those who watched him during those months saw the first shadow of frailty touch him. The tireless energy that had carried him from Shrewsbury to Agincourt began to wane. He rode daily along the siege lines, his face thinner, his eyes bright but hollowed by fatigue. Even as sickness spread through the camp, he refused rest. "We are all soldiers in the same service," he told his physicians when they urged him to withdraw. By late summer, Meaux fell. The English banners rose over its ramparts, the trumpets sounded, and the people cheered the king's name. But Henry did not join them. Fever had struck him down. Some said it was dysentery, others a wasting illness. The exact name lost to time. Whatever it was, it clung to him like a shadow that would not lift. He was carried from Meaux to Vincennes, near Paris, a royal lodge surrounded by quiet woods. There, the man who had ruled 2 kingdoms lay upon a narrow bed, his body failing, but his spirit serene. In the stillness of late August 1422, the great conqueror of Agincourt faced his final battle, not with sword or army, but with time itself. Catherine, summoned from England, arrived too late. At his bedside were his brothers Bedford and Gloucester, and a handful of priests. The chamber was dimly lit, its only light the flame of a single candle beside the crucifix. Outside, the sound of distant bells drifted from Paris. Henry, now 35, spoke little. His voice was faint but steady, the voice of a man who knew that his work was done. He asked first for news of his son, the infant prince born just months before. They told him the child was strong, and at that he smiled. "Then God has given England a future," he whispered. He turned to his brother Bedford. "Be his guardian. Teach him justice, not glory. Let him fear God more than man." Then, as silence filled the room, he asked for the Psalter to be read. The priest began softly, "In you, O Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame." Henry's lips moved with the words, his fingers tracing the edge of the cross upon his chest. A faint breeze stirred the curtains. The candle flickered. He looked once more toward the crucifix and said, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." And so, with that prayer, the same prayer uttered by countless souls before him, Henry of Monmouth, King of England and heir of France, passed from the world. News of his death traveled swiftly across both realms. In England, church bells tolled from Dover to York. In France, the sound echoed through the cathedrals he had conquered. The people wept openly, not just for their king, but for what he had represented, a hope that order and faith might heal the divisions of men. His body was brought back across the channel, borne by ship beneath black sails. At every port it passed, crowds gathered in silence, heads bowed. In Westminster Abbey, he was laid to rest beside his ancestors, his sword and crown placed upon the tomb. The chroniclers wrote that the abbey seemed to glow with a strange light that day, as though heaven itself had opened to receive him. And yet, beyond the solemn hymns and the gilded stone, a question lingered. What becomes of glory when its bearer is gone? Henry V had ruled for less than a decade, yet his reign reshaped an age. He had taken a fractured kingdom and given it unity. He had transformed a war of ambition into a crusade of faith. He had turned the burden of kingship into a form of service. In his life, the medieval ideal of the Christian king reached its brightest flame, and in his death, it began to fade. Catherine mourned him quietly, far from the councils of power. She would live on, her heart divided between 2 worlds, the memory of the man she had loved and the child who now bore his crown. That child, Henry VI, would inherit 2 kingdoms and the impossible task of holding them together. But for now, the story closed as all stories must, not in noise or triumph, but in stillness. The light of one age dimmed and another waited, uncertain, on the horizon. In the chronicles of both England and France, they wrote of him with reverence, the warrior who fought without hatred, the ruler who prayed without pride. His victories had filled the world with his name, but his final act had been to lay that name down before God. And in that surrender perhaps lay the true measure of greatness, that a man who had once commanded armies could at the end command only peace. Between the silence of one age and the dawn of another, history seemed to hold its breath. The death of Henry I was not merely the end of a reign, it was the dimming of a light that had guided two kingdoms through chaos into fragile order. Yet even as the last bell tolled for the warrior king, his shadow lingered across both shores, as if refusing to fade with the mortal world. England stood at a crossroads, its banners still heavy with the scent of victory, its faith still echoing with the king's final prayer. But beyond the mourning veils and solemn hymns, time was already moving, quietly, inevitably, toward the uncertain hands of a child, born into glory he could not yet understand. And so, as the candle of one Henry flickered out, another was lit, smaller, wavering, yet burdened with the weight of empire. The story that had begun in triumph would now be tested in endurance, from the stillness of Vincennes to the coronation cradle of Westminster, from a king who conquered through faith to a son who would inherit through fragility. The torch of destiny passed, trembling but unbroken. Thus began the next chapter, not of conquest, but of consequence, where the legacy of Henry V would echo through the rise and ruin of those who followed, and where the meaning of Agincourt itself would grow beyond the battlefield, becoming not only a memory of victory, but a lesson for all ages to come. When the bells of Westminster fell silent and the last echo of mourning faded, a new king, barely 9 months old, inherited the most powerful realm in Christendom. Henry VI, son of a legend, grandson of 2 dynasties, was crowned in cradle and shadow. The crown that had once rested on his father's brow now seemed far too heavy for the infant who wore it. All of England waited, not in triumph, but in unease. The peace Henry I had built with such discipline was a fragile bridge between 2 storms, and with his death, the wind began to rise again. The regency that governed in his name struggled to hold together what Henry IV's will and charisma had once bound. The English lords in France fought among themselves, their unity fraying like a banner left too long in the rain. The Duke of Bedford, loyal and capable, tried to preserve his brother's legacy, but the weight of empire was relentless. Burgundy, once ally, drifted away. The Dauphin, the future Charles VII, rallied a new France beneath the banner of faith and national pride. Within a few years, the victories of Agincourt and Troyes began to blur into memory. The French rose again, guided by a peasant girl who claimed divine visions, Joan of Arc, the voice of a reborn nation. The tide turned. English garrisons fell one after another. The dream of a dual monarchy, one king ruling both England and France, faded like mist over the Somme. And yet, through it all, the ghost of Henry I lingered, in banners and prayers, in the hearts of those who still believed that his reign had been touched by heaven. Chroniclers wrote of him not merely as a conqueror, but as the embodiment of an age when faith and order walked hand in hand. The contrast between father and son could not have been sharper. Henry V had been the image of resolve, stern, clear, guided by purpose. Henry VI, gentle and devout, lacked his father's fire. He loved books more than battles, prayers more than politics. But the world he inherited had no mercy for gentleness. Factions at court divided around him, Lancaster against York, ambition against piety. The seeds of civil war, sown long before on foreign soil, began to take root at home. The Wars of the Roses would soon bloom from those seeds, a conflict that would undo the very unity Henry V had fought to build. The white rose and the red would stain a century, and the name Henry, once a symbol of strength, would come to mean sorrow and loss. In the quiet halls of history, it is easy to forget how swiftly order turns to chaos, how brief is the life of peace, bought by the sword. But Henry V's story endures precisely because it captures that fragile balance, the moment when a kingdom stood poised between divine vision and human frailty, between faith and the inexorable tide of time. Centuries later, long after the banners had rotted and the last veterans of Agincourt had been buried beneath the English soil, a poet would resurrect the king and his cause. In the age of Elizabeth, when England once again faced a continent of rivals, William Shakespeare turned to the story of Henry V, not as history, but as mirror. His Henry was not merely a monarch, but a voice, eloquent, devout, yet profoundly human. On the stage of the globe, the king of the 15th century became the conscience of the 16th, a man who could unite a people through words as once he had through arms. Shakespeare's verses breathed life into the legend. His St. Crispin's Day speech, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," transformed Agincourt from a battle into an idea. It became the anthem of courage against all odds, of unity born not from power, but from shared struggle. Through that speech, the mud of northern France became sacred ground, and the weary soldiers of Henry's army became eternal companions in memory. In the centuries that followed, those words would echo across countless fields, whispered by soldiers before battle, quoted by leaders seeking to inspire faith in the impossible. The king who had died young was reborn each time the world sought meaning in courage. In literature, Henry V became the nation's moral compass, the warrior tempered by prayer, the conqueror humbled by grace. And in that image, Shakespeare gave England not merely a hero, but a reflection of itself, flawed, devout, resolute, and yearning for purpose. Historians, too, have long wrestled with the enigma of Henry V. Was he the last medieval knight or the first modern statesman, a man of faith or a master of politics cloaked in piety? The truth, as ever, lies between. He was both saint and strategist, a ruler who saw no contradiction between divine will and disciplined command. His campaigns, studied for centuries, reveal the mind of a tactician as precise as any to come. The victory at Agincourt was not luck, but the result of patience, terrain, and the quiet genius of leadership. His ability to hold a weary army together, to transform belief into endurance, stands as one of history's rare examples where faith and calculation met without conflict. Yet beyond strategy and statecraft, his enduring legacy lies in the moral language he left behind. Henry V's life was, in essence, a sermon written in steel and prayer, the story of a man who believed that the weight of a crown could be borne only by conscience. He saw kingship not as dominion, but as service, a trust between ruler, people, and God. And though his line would falter, though the wars that followed would drown his dream in blood and division, the idea he represented endured, that leadership must be both strong and just, and that glory without humility is hollow. In the final measure, Agincourt remains more than a date in history. It has become a symbol of courage under pressure, of unity in despair, of a voice that rises above the din of war to speak of something eternal. To stand at Agincourt today is to feel that echo, the damp earth, the low sky, the silence where once 1,000 prayers were whispered into the mist. You can almost hear it still, the rustle of banners, the heartbeat of waiting men, and through it all, a single voice, calm, steadfast, rising against the storm. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. It is not the cry of victory, but of remembrance, a vow that courage and faith will outlive kings, empires, and centuries. And as the mist closes once more over the fields of France, that vow endures, not as sound, but as spirit, a quiet, unending prayer carried by time itself, that from the frailty of men may yet come the strength of belief, and that from the fleeting light of one king's faith may shine the undying flame of humanity. History remembers Henry V not merely as a conqueror or a hero, but as a mirror held up to the eternal struggle within humankind between faith and ambition, power and humility, destiny and the fragile will of a single soul. His life was brief, yet every chapter burned with the conviction that leadership is not only the art of command, but the act of service. From the storm-soaked fields of Agincourt to the candlelit chambers of Troy, Henry's journey was more than a chronicle of battles won. It was a pilgrimage of spirit. He rose from the turbulence of youth to embody the virtues of kingship at its highest form, courage guided by conscience, victory tempered by prayer. And though his reign ended before its time, his vision outlived him. the belief that a kingdom founded upon faith and justice could stand unshaken even when the sword had long been laid down. The world that followed did not honor that ideal perfectly. His son's innocence gave way to chaos, and the wars of the roses tore apart the unity his hand had forged. Yet every generation since has looked back to Henry's age and found, within its light and its shadow, a reflection of its own longing for order, for faith, for meaning. In literature, Shakespeare would raise his story into legend, giving the world not only the voice of a king, but the echo of brotherhood. Through his words, the mist of Agincourt became the stage of eternity. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. The line still resonates wherever courage is tested, wherever faith must stand against despair. For historians, Henry remains the paradox of power, the warrior who sought peace, the ruler who bowed before God, the man who learned that greatness lies not in how long one reigns, but in how deeply one believes. His victories shaped nations, but his humility shaped memory. And so, as the curtain falls on this story, of a prince who became a legend, of a kingdom that rose and fell, of prayers whispered through centuries, we are left not with the clang of steel, but with the stillness of faith. Across the fields of northern France, the morning mist still lingers, just as it did on that October dawn. The arrows are gone, the banners faded, the king's long dust, yet the voice remains, soft but eternal. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. And with that final breath, Henry V's story ceases to be history and becomes something greater, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit and to the quiet truth that faith, not might, is what outlasts the crown.